Okay, once again, we're back. This is Bryan Prior from the Crime Victim Center. I'm one of the prevention educators, and introducing herself again is
Leslie Wagner, counselor for Crime Victim Center.
Yes, and I wanted to go ahead and do it that way because I had a slip of the tongue I noticed when I was listening to our first episode. I actually introduced you as one of my counselors, which either implies that you are counseling me or that I have some authority over you, neither of which is true. So I meant to say one of my colleagues and a counselor at the Crime Victim Center, but I slipped up on that. So I wanted to at least set the record straight on that. And we are here doing our second podcast episode. We're covering episodes 3 and 4 from the documentary Tiger King. I'm going to do my best because, again, when things get all carried away with the way they did the documentary, I'm really going to do my best to call it a documentary and to refer to these people as people and not characters, because, again, these are not characters. This isn't fake. This is a legitimate story. These people are real. This really happened. But we really covered a lot of the things that we saw from a prevention education standpoint, an awareness standpoint on my side, and then you from sort of a counseling and an advocacy standpoint from our line of work and the things that we see dealing with clients and dealing with our work. We did a really good overview, I think, of the documentary itself and covering episodes 1 and 2, but let's just get right into episode 3 with, if anybody has seen the documentary, this is the episode that is almost entirely devoted to Joe Exotic's main, quote, villain, Carol Baskin, and her second husband, Don Lewis, who goes missing under, mysterious circumstances. So from counseling and advocacy standpoint, what did you see? What are some of the things you kind of want to discuss and talk about from episode 3?
A lot of it dealt with Carol's past history of domestic violence and past relationships with her first husband, with her second husband, family relationships. They talked about what was going on at her home, what kind of things happened to her when she was younger, and just, and overall, she stayed with the individual for a long time, even though Don was a ladies' man. Even his first wife stayed with him, and she knew that he was having other women also. So you kind of wonder why these women were staying with this individual, knowing that he had different girlfriends out on the side. And that we'll kind of start talking about, financial means for people, and things like that. Why do people stay in relationships and deal with a cheating partner?
So let me just to just kind of get names to the story here, because again, it kind of jumps around even within the documentary. There were certain things the third time I watched this documentary that I picked up. I didn't pick up the first 2 times. But Carol Baskin, who you know from the documentary, is sort of the main antagonist, the enemy of Joe Exotic, who runs Big Cat Rescue in Florida. She was abused when she was a child in her teenage years. She was abused at her home. She ran away and winds up marrying a gentleman named Michael Murdoch when she was 17. That relationship wound up going abusive as well. And she was 20 when she meets Don Lewis, the husband, her second husband that goes missing. And what you're saying, and they just even barely bring it up, because you obviously picked up on this from your standpoint a lot quicker than most people would have noticed. She meets her second husband, Don Lewis, when she's 20, and does not leave her first husband and then marry her second husband until she's 24. So that's 4 years where she is really
Right.
caught in between two relationships, which I think a lot of people would look at that and maybe that aren't familiar go, well, that might be a sign that like she's manipulating or something is up. But it's really not uncommon when you're in abusive relationships. It's really difficult to get away once you, even when you know, all right, now is the time, now we're going to leave.
Right, right. Um, she probably had that sense of security with Don at that point, knowing that he himself had another family, he had financial means. So maybe after that 4 years, they were ready to be together instead of, you know, going behind their partners' backs about different things. Um, but let's take a look at some of Carol's past history from when she was a teen. She explains how at age 14, she comes from a very religious family, very tight knit, you know, and she was sexually assaulted at age 14. Um, she told her family, and then they didn't believe her. And we see that way too often when it comes to young teens or younger children, that when they come forward to their family and they say, hey, excuse my dog, she's barking in the background.
Yeah, it's okay. My wife's, you know, in the fridge and everything too, so it's all right.
Yeah. Too many kids come forward and their parents, their guardian, their grandparents, whoever that they're living with, foster parents, whoever, has a tendency not to believe these children because they don't want that adult that's being accused. They think to themselves, well, so and so, Uncle Johnny could never do something like this. Are you sure that really happened? You know, then that child starts to doubt themselves. Well, maybe they really didn't do that. So there's that confusion, the influence from the family when they say, you know, are you sure that this really happened? So and so could never have done something like that to you.
Right.
And Carol's family, that's exactly what had happened. She had gone to her family, her parents, and said, you know, these boys, these young men, sexually assaulted me. What should I do about it? And her family pretty much told her, we're not going to talk about this because you shamed our family by having premarital sex.
Exactly. And that's a situation where you see a lot. We talk about, I know we talked about in episode 1, the idea of victim blaming and everything. You see that, the religious aspect, but there's also, and it could not even be, it might not necessarily be a religious aspect, but sometimes there's this idea, this mental concept that can't really handle comfortably the idea of young girls and sex. And so the mindset becomes, you wanted this, you were asking for it. Now, if you combine that with also a religious ideology, this is where you get into the idea of shame and everything like that. So it could be that they didn't believe what she was saying, but it also, she seemed to also imply it could just be the idea that because of their feelings towards sexuality and her being a young girl, that the just panic mode, if you want to use that term, that they went to was, okay, our young daughter just engaged in sex, just had sex done to her. Okay, what happened? She must have wanted it. She must have been asking for it. And that just goes
Right.
that road of, the victim blaming. And like I said before, you see that a lot of times. It's one of the dilemmas you see sometimes, a lot of times with male victims too. And we're obviously going to talk about the idea of some of the dilemmas that Don Lewis, the missing husband, ran into when it seemed to a lot of the bystanders and even to the legal system that he was in an abusive relationship, that Carol was abusing him in certain ways, and the dilemmas he had with dealing with getting that resolved.
Right, right. So with Carol's teenage sexual assault, she more or less said, you know what, I need to get away from this family. And that's what happens a lot of times when young girls and young boys, I don't want to eliminate them from it, when they get that support from home, they say enough is enough. Either they run away, they go live with another family member, you know, and so forth, and they never really seriously deal with the situation. And then come, you know, adulthood, maybe even later on in life, they're remembering what happened to them and telling themselves, I need to deal with this. I've kept this blocked in my mind for so long that I don't know how to feel anymore. So for Carol's case, she left home at age 15, and you know, she married young at age 17. Then she started to have a family, but in the sense, she also got herself into a domestic violence situation with her first husband. And then she ended up leaving him later on because she was with Don.
Mm-hmm.
But that also took time to actually be with him also. She explained, you know, hey, I had to throw a potato at him just so I can distract him so I could leave the house. That's all too common for people that want to leave, you know, the home. You got to hurry up and distract them, throw something at them so you can run out the front door and find safety.
And then
it happens way too often.
Yeah, and another thing that unfortunately one of the things that kind of struck me is like, man, I've heard this before, I've seen this before, is, you know, from the prevention education and the awareness, we do a lot of work, you know, talking about trafficking and trafficking victims. And you had mentioned in episode 1 the issues of labor trafficking that we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
as far as that goes. But man, the idea of, here's this young woman that just she's already has left home, so she doesn't have the support system of her family, her, you know, her birth family, abusive husband, out pacing, completely vulnerable, obviously in a bad place. And here comes the second husband, Don Lewis, in his truck, drives by, tries to get her to come into the truck. She won't. Goes around the block, tries again. She won't. Third time around, he's got a gun. And he tells her, look, you can hold the gun. I just want to talk. They wind up sleeping together that night. The number of, I could go right now in the other room and grab you at least a couple different books I'm reading on human trafficking where almost the exact same thing happened. When the victim wound up being approached, they were in a very vulnerable spot, and this person came along, the savior, you know, model, the Romeo, I think they call him like the Romeo trafficker. If he wanted to, like, use her for labor trafficking or sex trafficking, he did it. Now, from his point of view,
right.
he was honestly just trying to get out of his marriage. As you mentioned, he was a womanizer, and I think he had designs from that moment to try to begin a relationship with her. But, you know, substitute that for trafficking, and he basically did it. You know, he approached her the same way as a trafficker would when they see a vulnerable victim. And so, yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people, when they get into the way, and this is the way the documentary is set up, is that here was this guy that, you know, fell for her, and he's the victim. Because you're supposed to, if you watch the documentary, it's pretty obvious you're supposed to hate Carol Baskin, and you're supposed to feel that.
Yeah, I think that was the whole goal of the, yeah.
And you're supposed to think that she killed her husband, and if she did that, and if she's supposed to be evil, then you got to set him up to be a victim as much as you can. But as you kind of mentioned some things about like the way he may have been treating and acting towards her, he may not have been the quote victim as much as it seems. But then you get into the thing with the PFA and everything. Talk about that.
Well, they also talked about how Don had gone to the local courthouse and asked for protection from abuse order. And during the interviews of his family members, they said their father would never have done that unless he really seriously thought he was going to be, you know, afraid of this woman. And a lot of times, many times, you will not see men go to the local courthouse and try and get a protection from abuse order. Not 90% of the people that apply for the orders are females against the males. And, you know, I think we're in a society where we feel that men should not cry, men should not worry about things like this. You know, if your wife is at home beating you, just deal with it. You know, men don't tell things like that out in public. Men don't go and get PFA orders. And when a man does go and try and get a PFA order against their partner, they're kind of looked at differently. And, you know, and it makes it difficult for the judge to kind of believe what's going on and what he's saying. And that shows in Don's case, and this was like, what, the 80s, 90s? I can't remember, Bryan, if you remember what year that was.
Sure.
I want to say it was like 97, maybe.
I'll go ahead and look that up, but you go ahead. You keep talking about that because it's interesting it's important to note that when you talk about the idea that it's different, and this was something we were talking about before we began, that we obviously have had experiences dealing with clients or working, you know, on my end. I've spoken with a lot of you and the counselors there about what it's like having to go and try to get PFAs and everything, and why some of them are granted, why some of them are not. And one of the things is clear is that there is difference in the way male victims and female victims are examined and analyzed when it comes to things like PFAs. Because, like you said, I think it's maybe not necessarily, oh, well, if you're being abused, just deal with it because you're a guy, but it's more like you're the guy. And I like to think that the law, or at least the court system, was like, well, if you got all this money, you have all the ability, if you really think she's abusing you or doing something negative, just get out, leave. You're the one that's got all the money.
Right.
You know, hop in the car, hop on your plane, just leave. Just move out of the house and use your money, go through the court system and do it that way. Ignoring the fact that he is saying that she said she was going to kill him, that she has a gun, he had a gun, and she took it and hid it. Now, I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but I'm saying I've spoken to some people that have had PFAs granted for a lot less than that when the victim was female. Wait a minute, he's got a gun, he took your gun and hid it, and he said he's going to kill you. That might get you a PFA if you're a female victim. It's not a guarantee, but it's different. So I'm going to look up when that happened. But go ahead, keep going.
Are very good. But for a man to come in there and say, she took my gun, she's going to kill me. Judges have a tendency to look at things differently. We live in a double standard society. You know, boys are kind of taught to cry and just kind of suck it up and keep moving. And that's where, you know, judges, society treats people differently by, you know, and I hate to say this, but just by our gender.
Yeah.
You know?
And
it should not feel like that.
Yeah, it was 97 that he went missing. So it was probably some small period of time before that he had filed for the PFA. So we're talking, yeah, mid 90s. And
yeah,
not to try to, I feel a lot of times when we talk about, and you know this because this has happened on your end as well as on mine, when you talk about the idea of victimization, and when we talk about what we can do socially to try to improve that, where we have a situation where if someone is a victim, the last thing you want is for them to be re-victimized or get into the things of victim blaming. And it's important to understand that when we're talking about these things, we're talking about, like at this moment in this particular case, Don Lewis, and why when he filed for the PFA, it maybe wasn't taken as seriously as it could have. We just got done talking about a situation where you have this young girl, Carol Baskin, who was sexually assaulted. She was basically gang raped, and her parents committed a form of victim blaming on her. It's
right.
not a situation where women are getting it more or men are getting it more. They're both getting it. It's just different in both situations. And we really, I think, got to work on the idea that it happens. And we need to do what we can to try to minimize it across the board and not create a situation where we focus on one form of victim blaming and ignore, you know, other populations, male, female, LGBT. You know, we need to focus across the board on the idea of when someone's a victim, they're a victim. And no one really asks for any of this. You can think what you want about him being a womanizer and the money and the influence he might have had over her. No one really asks to have the person they're in a relationship with threaten to kill him on the regular. So.
Right. And Dawn obviously saw that she was a threat. There had to have been more to it than just one incident where she was being very aggressive towards him, for him to actually reach out and say, hey, I need this protection from her. Will someone please help me? And then 2 months later, he disappears.
Yeah. And that's,
you know?
That's another thing that we see a lot working, you know, helping victims and stuff like that. You really got to make sure, it may seem like you're overwhelming the situation or the system, but you got to kind of throw all of it in there. Because the last thing you want is when you get to a point where you decide, okay, male or female, this is an abusive relationship. This person may kill me. I need to get out. I'm going to file for a protection from abuse. Those can be very dangerous situations, male or female. If you're the victim in an abusive relationship, it's usually when you're trying to leave that the danger really starts getting escalated. So if you decide to go to a point where you're going to try to go for a protection from abuse, it's so important that you make sure that you put every possible thing in there that you can, because the last thing you want is a situation where I think you're right, where because Don Lewis talked about that one incident that had just happened, and that was what was written on that report, it gives the impression of that was it. That one.
Right. And we encourage individuals that want to get a protection from abuse to write things down ahead of time. You know, think back. What kind of things have they been doing? Have they been verbally abusing you, financially abusing you? And you write those things down, because the more that you put down in that summary for that protection from abuse is more on your side to get that granted. If you just say, oh, he told me I was a fat pig, you know, yes, that is emotional abuse, but what else is going on there? You know, did he threaten your life? Did he take your kids away from you? Did he punch you in the face? Did he, you know, cause you to have to go to the hospital and so forth? Did he sexually assault you? So those things, you know, as some victims that go to the courthouse and try and get the PFAs, they have to put in detail what has been on, not just what had happened the day before. You know, there's things that always lead up to that one day where you say, enough is enough. I'm tired of this. But make sure you put all that down so the judge sees that there's a pattern here. You know, on January 1st, he punched me in the face. February 1st, he kicked me in the stomach. You know, keep a mental summary of what's going on there.
Right. You really want that moment to be the that's your chance to tell the system, the judge, you know, here is why we're at this point. Here is why I've chosen to come here and everything. That is your chance right there to tell the story. And unfortunately, a lot of times you see people that are in abusive relationships because they're so used to not being able to tell their story, or being told that they're not worth anything, or that what they say really doesn't matter. You get defeated, you get beat down by that. And now here's your chance that someone will listen to you, will listen to what you have to say, and will do what they can for you. You got to take that opportunity and really just throw everything in there and just reveal everything that you have been through and that has gone on. And also bearing in mind, recognizing that you're also gonna deal with some possible stereotypes and some possible generalizations, the things that, like we mentioned, female victim, male victim, LGBT victim. So you got to kind of try to get over those hurdles possibly too. So even if you think there might be a chance that this could possibly happen, that could possibly, like you said, just write it all down, put every possible thing, everything that is important in there. Not to dismiss it in any way, but just to take from what I know as an educator and a teacher, like my students, when they're writing for their final exams, you know, important exams and material, I always tell them, write everything, write everything that you possibly can. I can always stop reading. Once I understand what's going on, I can stop reading. If it's not on there, I don't know it. If it's not on there, I'm not aware of it. And you know, just for no, I'm not even counting one, you know, trying to compare one to the other, but yeah, that's just on an exam. That's on one exam in one class in their life. You're talking about a protection from abuse. If it's not on,
Right.
As far as the court, the third party in this particular case is concerned, if it's not on there, it didn't happen. And that's what we see, I think, in the cases. It was just seen as words, and it was just seen as one moment. But speaking of like words and writing and everything, I wanted to get your opinion. We'll just kind of wrap up, you know, what they showed in episode 3, and then kind of get into a bit in the episode 4. At some point, Joe Exotic gets a hold of Carol Baskin's diary and is reading that on the air on his live internet show, and is using that as evidence or as proof that she maybe that going through is, just to kind of wrap up, he was Don Lewis, Carol Baskin's husband, was going to leave her, go to Costa Rica. He had a girlfriend down there. He was going to start a new life in Costa Rica. The theory is she found out about that, she killed him and fed him to the tigers. While this is going on, while there's explaining this to the documentary, think what you will one way or the other about that story. Joe Exotic has, undeniably, it is Carol Baskin's diary, and he is reading pages and pages and pages of that on the internet. I want to know what you thought about that from the point of view of where we work and what we deal with.
Obviously, because he was broadcasting it all over the social media, he was cyberbullying her. Sometimes we have a tendency to look at cyberbullying as, you know, teens and so forth, you know, because kids, how they are with their cell phones nowadays. But adults can be the same way. There's always that constant Facebook messages and you know, just putting that other partner out there saying they did this to me, they did that, and so forth. And with Joe's situation, he's dressing up a blow-up doll of Carol, and then, you know, all of a sudden he is putting a gun to this doll and blowing her away on his TV program.
Mm-hmm.
If it's on social media or threatening, I don't know what else there is. You know, that is strictly cyberbullying. That is the threats that
Absolutely.
what's that?
Well, absolutely. And I was going to say, and this just kind of popped into my head, what he did is basically the same thing as, if you recall, there was a lot of discussion about cyberbullying and harassment and threats on the internet and everything. When was her name? Kathy Griffin, the comedian, when she did the photo shoot and she had the bloody, severed, decapitated mannequin head that looked like Donald Trump. Her career, her livelihood is essentially over. She's certainly she had like her own TV show, her own reality show and everything. She was on a certain level of status that she's essentially a pariah now, because the community, the society went, wow, that is some serious threats. That's serious threats of violence. And I think, you know, taking political and everything aside of it, there was enough people that saw that as, even if you don't want to consider it as a legitimate threat to Donald Trump, it certainly was harassment and vulgar and kind of immoral and reprehensible. And like you said, he literally takes a loaded gun done up to be her and pulls the trigger on his show. And I'm not saying everybody, but I bet you there were some people watching the documentary that kind of got a chuckle out of that and didn't see it for what it was.
Right. And, you know, kind of going back to the social media and the cyberbullying and stuff, I just want to try to reintegrate that whatever you put on the internet, on your Facebook, on your Snapchat, on your Instagram, it stays there forever. I'm sure right now we could probably Google that particular scene from Tiger King where Joe is, you know, shooting Carol's blow-up doll.
Yep.
You know, there's probably some type of meme out there with him doing that. But we, as an agency, we try to educate young teens, a lot of times, sometimes even younger than 13, you know, 12, 11, 10 years old, that when you have a phone and you put things on that internet, it is there forever. You might be able to erase that Snapchat from your phone, but it's still out there. And somebody is going to,
yeah, absolutely.
You know?
And one of the things from an education standpoint and prevention, it was a little bit before I started that we looked at the idea of teaching the idea of internet safety and awareness and things like cyberbullying and harassment and things like that in elementary school, which I think 5-6 years ago, go, no. But I'm telling you, I go into class, and even if I'm going into an educational situation where we're going to do things like talking about no-go tell and sexual abuse and body security to elementary schools, I go in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, I'll just ask, I'll say, how many of you are on the internet? How many of you go on the internet and play video games online? And don't raise their hand. How many of you play video games online with someone you've never met before? Almost all the hands go up. 4th, 5th grade, you start seeing the hands go up for that they have cell phones. And so, and getting back to what we said in episode 1, not everybody knows Joe Exotic, okay? The reason why we wanted to do this was, yes, to kind of talk about some of the things we saw on the show, and specifically to things that happened to Joe Exotic, that happened with Carol Baskins and the people that are on that show. But not everybody knows Joe Exotic. Everybody knows a child or an adult that has posted something on the internet, and you just go, are you serious? Really? And it's interesting, you know, watching in the documentary, the people that worked with Joe Exotic, when he really started ramping up, when you talk about the blow up doll in the diary, this was when he was really ramping up his attacks and his rivalry with Carol Baskin. There are people in the documentary, like, we were telling him, stop it, don't do this, this isn't good, like, people are seeing this, people are watching this, like, this can be used against you as well. And
he just kept doing it and kept doing it and kept doing it. I think he felt better by bullying her on social media. Once he realized what social media was all about, he was just like, oh, I'm going to get this out all over the place. People are going to love me and they're going to hate her.
Yeah, and he only saw it from his perspective. That's
right.
that I tell a lot of times when I go into middle schools and high schools. We talk about like posting stuff on the internet. You got to understand, like you said, once you put it out there, it is out there forever. But you also have to understand, once it's out there, you have no control over what people are going to think about what you post. You may feel that if they're watching your show and they're a fan of yours, that if you post this, that they're going to feel the way you want them to feel. In other words, I have a Facebook page. Only my friends can see my Facebook page. A lot of them, I feel, have similar feelings and ideas and thoughts and opinions that I do. I think most people, that's what it is. Your friends on your Facebook tend to have certain things that they agree with you on. If I post something that I think, wow, they'll think this is really funny, they'll get what I'm going for, I gotta understand that once I post it, there's a chance that they might also find it very vulgar and offensive and unethical and inappropriate. I don't have any control over that once I post it. And so
right.
not every kid or every high school person or adult that watched the show has their own Joe Exotic TV show. But if you got your own Facebook page, your own Instagram, your own Snapchat, understand once you post stuff up there, people get to feel however they want to feel about it. And you can try to, after the fact, go, well, that's not what I meant. That wasn't what I was going for. I was just trying to be sarcastic. I wasn't trying to be serious. You don't get to decide how other people feel once you post something online.
Right. And, you know, just to kind of follow up with that, when we read things, we read our text messages, you know, things on social media, we don't see that emotion in somebody's body language as if we're talking to them face to face. You can actually interpret that statement that you're reading to be something totally different, offensive, you know, hurt feelings, whatever, but it's words. So we're picking up the emotions that are coming out of those words.
Right.
Because we're not seeing that person face to face now.
And what we see is Joe tends to see things just from his point of view, which is very common when someone is what we call narcissistic, you know, very, you know, egotistical and very selfish. And he clearly kind of has the characteristic of that, which plays great for the documentary or whatever. But I think we all know somebody that can't help but see everything just from their point of view. They're the person that when we're having a bad day, when we're having a hard time, and we try to talk to them about something that we're going through, they can't help but compare it to something that's happened to them. They can't help themselves but to talk about how it's just like something that happened to them, and now we're going down the road where now we're talking about when they were victimized or when they were hurt. And that can be very difficult to deal with. And of course, that ties into what we see now moving into episode 4. There's a person we're introduced to named Jeff Owen. Jeff Owen is a business partner, was a business partner of Joe Exotic, who, again, talking about the point of view, Joe wanted money and he needed money to fight the legal battles he was dealing with Carol Baskin because she was suing him for copyright. She won $1 million lawsuit against him. He needed finances. He needed someone to help him keep the zoo going and to fight Carol Baskin. And he finds Jeff Owen. And that's kind of the gist of episode 4. But before he even does that, he had somebody else that he was getting financial help from. So why don't you talk about the victimization aspects of episode 4 and what we kind of learned that Joe did when you watch episode 4.
So what Joe had done was he had gone to his parents for financial assistance. And we've seen this so many times at our workplace where adult children, possibly, you know, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, will go to that wealthy parent and say, I need some financial assistance. And that's exactly what Joe did. But in the meantime, while Joe's going to his parents and saying, I need help with my zoo, he's not realizing that it is hurting his parents financially to the point where Carol doing them also.
Yeah.
Joe signs over
Just a
the
bit
zoo.
there, but to be clear, yeah, because he started putting his mother and father, because he put his parents financially involved in this fight that he was having with Carol Baskin, well, then their names are on the documents. They're a part of the lawsuit now too. So they're being hurt, they're being abused in that situation as well, because, well, their names are on the documents. They're part of the legal aspect. And he does that with some of his coworkers. He does that with his one husband, John, as well. Basically, because he's only looking from his point of view, I need your money. I need you to do this for me. He's putting them on the hook to be hurt by other people as well.
Right. So then in the meantime, the sheriff's department's coming in saying, hey, we're going to take your home away from you. We're going to take your assets. We're going to take your car and so forth. And the way that the show portrayed it, it was kind of like mom and dad were not aware what was going on. They were they wanted to help their son, which is fine. But how much is too much help for your child? When they taken your livelihood away, in a sense where, here, I'm signing over my home to you. What else do you need? And then that adult child, that adult grandchild, whoever says, well, I need more, I need more, I need more. If you saw the little snippet where the niece came in and said, hey, grandma and grandpa, what's going on here? You're about to lose your home because you signed over your home, your financial means, over to Joe. This has to stop. And for a lot of elderly people, they don't have that extra family member coming into their home and saying, this needs to stop. This is what's going on. And we see this with caregivers. So it just isn't family members that take advantage of the elderly and their financial status, because we all know that the elderly, if you're 80, 70, 80, 90 years old, and you learn how to save your money because that's the way that you were raised.
Right.
And then there was a little snippet where Joe's parents were on social media again and says, here's a GoFundMe video. Help us, help my son. Well, they had to do that because Joe had put them in a predicament where they were going to lose everything on their end. And it should not be the grandparents, the parents' responsibility because of their poor choices that their adult grandchildren have made. You know?
And you see that he, even when they do that video, it's obviously something Joe set up. He's going to put on his TV show. He's going to try to get sympathy because now Carol is going after his look at his parents. Look at what's going on. She went after Joe's parents, and his mom even says, "This is Carol Baskin. She's been after my son, and now she's after me."
Right.
Basic. It's a slight bit of fact, but there's also a fact that if Joe doesn't have them sign their names and their finances in with him, Carol's not going after his parents. She didn't care one way or the other about his parents. It was when he tied them to what they were going through, they became a part of it as well. And one of the other things is, again, not everybody knows a Joe Exotic. Not everybody might know somebody that's like asking for the house as collateral in a multi-million-dollar copyright lawsuit. But we've unfortunately seen a lot of people, especially in the Erie community, that have that adult son or daughter that's dealing with some drug or substance abuse issues. And that was even going on. I think one of the things that does not get brought up, I mean, it kind of does get addressed in some of the later episodes, is Joe was no stranger to substances, drugs and alcohol and everything. And that puts desperation on the user in that situation. It puts desperation on the addict, and that can lead to them financially victimizing people they know because it's the drug. And you see a lot of times with people that are victims of financial abuse, could be elderly, could not be, could be, not considered. But if If the person victimizing you is a family member, it tends to fall in the categories of shame, especially if they're elderly, like I can't take care of my own finances anymore. I can't look out for myself anymore. Or getting back to what happened with Carol when she was victimized, there's the idea we keep this within the family. We don't talk about this. We cover this up. We don't get into this.
Right, right.
But yeah, basically he gets really into a lot of financial problems, and that leads to him reaching out to this big sort of Las Vegas mogul financial guru wearing like the UFC, the martial arts affliction jacket and everything with the bandana, Jeff Owen and his wife, and they kind of did stuff with big cats and everything like that. And he basically comes in and is going to throw his money and his weight around to try to support Joe Exotic. And he's going to give Joe Exotic what he wants. He's going to give all the money to help Joe Exotic fight Carol Baskin. But how does that wind up going?
Well, I just want to correct you one thing. I believe Jeff's last name was Lowe.
Lowe, you're right. Lowe. Oh, I don't know what I said on. You're right. Jeff Lowe. It is Jeff Lowe.
I don't mean to correct you, but that one, I caught you on that one a couple times.
Okay, thank you.
I came to the zoo and said, hey, I hear you're in trouble. I have the financial means. Let's see what we can do for you. And I believe he also needed a place to put his tigers, because he was one of those tiger collectors also. They showed him in Las Vegas with the women, the cars, the money, the tigers. So he had that status already built up, and he promised Joe all these wonderful things. And then in the end, he ended up taking the zoo away from Joe. But I believe, there was a breaking point for Joe. He was exhausted from all the lawsuits, the financial problems that he had. He couldn't pay his employees. He couldn't take care of the tigers, and he just came to a breaking point at this point. And Jeff came in at the right time and said, "Here, I'll fix your problems. This is what we got to do." And then their relationships kind of started out good, because I think Joe thought that Jeff was going to be the almighty savior. And then that's where the manipulation comes in with their friendship.
Yep. And so we're talking about a business partnership here between Joe Exotic and Jeff Lowe. But really what happens is no different than what we started out talking about on this particular episode with what Don Lewis, the second husband of Carol Baskin, probably did in that truck when they were driving around and talking. It's the idea of if you're in a bad, vulnerable place, either from your doing, doesn't matter how, if you're in a vulnerable place, if someone wants to possibly manipulate that for their end, they have that ability. That's, you're vulnerable. That's exactly what the idea of vulnerable means. It means is you're open to being preyed on. And the episode 4 kind of wraps up with the idea that it seems like Joe had a design on what he wanted to do, what he wanted to get. I'm sorry, Jeff Lowe had an idea of what he wanted to get from Joe Exotic, courted him, the honeymoon period they seem to have. Yeah. Absolutely put on the perfect image of, here's what I can do for you. Here's what I'm going to be for you, Joe. You're having some problems. You're dealing with some situations. Let me talk to your lawyers. And between Joe Exotic's lawyer and Jeff, they decide, listen, you've moved the name of this zoo around so many times to try to, basically what happens is, the idea is, if the zoo changes names, then it technically changes ownership. And if Carol wants to sue the zoo, they have to start over again. Kind of true, right. Not. It's a whole legal thing we won't even go into. But basically, Jeff and the attorney says, look, put the zoo in Jeff's name. And then what winds up happening is Jeff got exactly what he wanted. He had the zoo now. And he had that control and that manipulation. He had the most important thing in Joe's life, really, over his head now. And he could basically make Joe do whatever he wanted. He could make Joe's employees do whatever he wanted. He's in charge legally and officially. And again, not everybody knows a Joe Exotic. Not everybody knows somebody who owns a zoo. But I think not just people like us that work at the Crime Victim Center, but anybody that has enough friends and family and a large enough social circle, you know someone who's been in a relationship where the person entered into the relationship from a bit of vulnerability, and the relationship went really bad, and it turned out to not be what that person thought it was. And you come to find out that the other person in the relationship manipulated them, found them in a vulnerable time, got what they needed to from them, and manipulated them. And unfortunately, you see a lot of times victims blame themselves. Why didn't I see it? Why didn't I know it? And what they don't understand is they were being manipulated. And from Joe's standpoint, I'm going to be honest with you, this is just me. It's not a CVC Prevention Ed opinion. This is Bryan Prior watching Tiger King. I think Joe was trying to manipulate Jeff. I think the idea that, you know what, I'll get Jeff to think I'm the perfect guy, I'm awesome, I can give him all this publicity and stuff. I'm planning on running for office, which we'll talk about that in the next episode. But I think he was trying to work Jeff, and Jeff played him. So very interesting when you see people that have been raised and have been in a lot of manipulative, abusive relationships. It's very difficult for them to have a, quote, healthy relationship. They tend to just go into every relationship trying to say, what can I get from you? What can you get from me? How do I got to do this? How do I got to do that? So
you made me think of the term catfish when you were explaining Jeff and Joe's relationship and manipulating and deceiving, each other. Jeff made it look like he was like this extravagant businessman, but was he really? So that term catfish kind of came in my mind about, and that happens oh so often, and it goes back to the social media stuff. We think we're talking and we're communicating with that one particular person, and they come to find out it really isn't that person that we're talking to. And catfish just kind of came in my mind there.
No, and you're absolutely right, because what the episode ends basically with the sort of last line, the dramatic music and everything like that. Again, you got to watch how you're being manipulated with the filming and everything, which I'm just going to talk about a couple things from that. Just kind of, because again, we're kind of being manipulated too. One could argue we're maybe in not the healthiest of relationship with the documentarian here. We're kind of being manipulated too. But he sets up the end of the episode, and he basically goes, well, it turns out he was renting his mansion, and he was behind on these payments on these cars that he was driving. And it's not an uncommon thing that you see, that people that tend to show off a lot of the money. There's an aura, an aura, I should say, an aura of fakeness to it. It looks what it is, but it's not. And it turns out that this Jeff Lowe didn't have all this money and everything they claimed to, but it didn't matter once he got that zoo in his name.
Right.
Speaking of kind of like manipulation and how we as viewers kind of get manipulated by the documentary, I wanted to ask a question to you, and we can kind of wrap up a couple other things that are just brought up in between episodes 3 and 4 from the documentary. You corrected me on the name Jeff Owen. It's not Jeff Owen, it's Jeff Lowe.
Right.
Who Brandon Chappell is.
I don't remember him.
No, you don't, because the name Brandon Chappell is never brought up. And Brandon Chappell is only seen very briefly in one of the episodes. Brandon Chappell, again, remember, this is a documentary. So for people, if you're watching this from the idea of learning stuff about the documentary and kind of taking it away, I know a lot of people feel like they know Joe Exotic to the point that there are people trying to get him a presidential pardon for the murder for hire that he ultimately goes to jail for. If you don't know who Brandon Chappell is, be very careful about your idea that you know who Joe Exotic is, because Brandon Chappell is Joe Exotic's son.
Oh, I did not catch that.
Joe Exotic has a son. He has a 38-year-old son from a previous marriage. Again, the documentary tries to make you feel like you know everything about Joe Exotic. He has a son. The son worked at the zoo. When we talked about the financial problems and how that can, create unhealthy relationships, when the zoo was starting to go down, Joe's son, Brandon Chappell, was working at the zoo. Brandon Chappell's wife was also working for the zoo. She was the accountant for the zoo. Joe tried to get her to fudge the books, to try to manipulate the accounting numbers in case the IRS or the federal bureaus came around and everything like that. And his son said, you know what? Nope, forget it. We're leaving, and left. So again, that shows you the financial dilemmas that can create unhealthy relationships and everything. Here's a son that most viewers aren't even aware existed. And his relationship with his father was affected by all these financial things and some of the unhealthy choices that
and they introduced Brandon in the 4th episode?
He is in a picture. It's in one of the episodes. You see him in a picture, and apparently you can see him in the background in some of the scenes. They don't show his name. They don't give him a chance to talk or anything like that. And again, this could be for whatever reason the documentarian and Joe came up with. But we think, as a viewer, that we know Joe. We think that we have been given a viewing into his life. And here it turns out he's got a son. He had a wife. We know about his husbands. We don't even know about his wife. And how many times do we, as bystanders, do we as people in social circles, in friendships, acquaintanceships, you think you know somebody, you think you know the full story of a relationship, you make your understandings and your judgments about who's the abuser, who's the victim, who was the healthy one, who was the unhealthy one. But it's important to understand that you know as much as the people in the relationship let you know sometimes. And you might not know everything. You might not know that Joe was a chief, Joe Exotic was a chief of police in Texas. And that it was his squad car. I did not know that. It was his police squad car that he was driving when he drove off the road and tried to kill himself.
Okay.
So any other things that we didn't kind of talk about from episodes 3 or 4 you just kind of wanted to touch on and wrap up before we call it a day on episode 2 here?
No, I think we might have went overboard over time a little bit, but that's okay.
Yeah.
No, I think we kind of discussed everything that we wanted to talk about before the podcast, and hopefully we can finish this out for episodes 5 and 6 next week and keep it going.
Yeah, we might have to double up on the last week here. I want to try to get everything in the month of April for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so we got 5 and 6. Now, normally I would say then we covered the last episode 7, but for anybody who's familiar with the show, or if you're not, there was a follow-up after the documentary came out, sort of a response. If you're familiar with some of the reality shows like Bachelor, Bachelorette, Survivor, you have like all the people come back. You have like the reunion show. Well, they kind of did an episode of that too. So we got 5 and 6 and 7, 8. So maybe do 2 more. But again, for anybody who's watching these, I want to give credit to Angie Devine, who basically did the video and set up the YouTube and everything. If you're watching this episode like you were episode 1 on YouTube, she's the one that set all that up. We just recorded the audio and gave it to her, and she ran with it.
Exactly. Thank
you, her for that. But yeah, when you're watching these, please, anybody on our Facebook or in the comments on the YouTube, if you have any questions or anything you felt we didn't discuss and you kind of noticed or feel that might be appropriate, talking, from the idea of Sexual Assault Awareness Month and dealing with topics and issues like victimization, please let us know. We'll give you a shout out for sure.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, thank you again. Have a great one. I'm going to deal with my cats. I'm sure people heard them meowing and yelling in the background at a certain point here. So take care, stay safe, and yeah, we'll be talking again pretty soon. We'll be obviously talking about the further manipulation and narcissism and selfishness of Joe Exotic with his husbands, and where it goes from there for sure. So yeah,
Expected an update for next week.
absolutely. Thank you for sure. Again, thank you, Leslie. Take care, and we'll be talking again.
Okay.